Hello, and welcome to Wellness Wednesday with 3W. Wellness Wednesday is sponsored by 3W Medical for Women, a nonprofit medical clinic offering free of charge or low-cost reproductive health services to women in the Seattle area, regardless of income or insurance status. 3W does not profit off of the reproductive health choices women make. The information shared in this podcast is the opinion of the speaker or speakers. Medical information is not intended as individual medical consultation, but for general education only. Always consult your own health professional for personalized advice regarding medical decisions. And if you're in the Seattle area, consider making an appointment to consult with us. I'm Helen Nguyen, CEO and co-founder of 3W Medical for Women and the host of today's podcast. Hi there, Wellness Wednesday listeners. This is Helen Nguyen, CEO of 3W Medical for Women. Thank you so much for joining us again this Wednesday. This is another tough podcast that I'm recording, and it's tough because our guest today, Brian Halleck, who's an attorney, he's part of my community, and I'm so thankful for him to share his story, but it's going to be a hard one to hear. I know that he's moved past it, but he's going to be approaching his personal experience with his struggle and his past with pornography. And I'm just so thankful for you, Brian, for sharing this story with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I just wanted to start out, and your story is powerful, so I just want you to go with the flow and let you share with our listeners. This is a tough topic because it's in the media a lot right now, especially with the famous singer Billie Eilish. I think she just came out and said that she started watching pornography at a very, very, very young age, and how it's like really terrible for you. I feel like that's the first time a celebrity has really come out to say that. And she's gotten very mixed feedback about her testimony. When Brian was so open and honest with me, I said, can you share this with our podcast listeners? So just to dive in, Brian, when did it start for you? When did you first start watching pornography? At what age and kind of what platform?
So I'm about 50 years old, and so this would have been in the 1970s, right?
Okay.
And so it's in those days, pornography was not as accessible, and so it would be mostly print media, and then maybe in the 1980s, it kind of went to video cassettes, and these would all be things that we would essentially access through an older relative, right? Some older relative who thought they were being surreptitious of having some pornography under the mattress or something like that. And then when they're at work, the kids go through their parents' bedroom and find stuff and then and look at it. And I probably starting from about age 10. And I never thought of it as anything, that there was anything wrong with it. It just seemed sort of like a normal thing. Of course, it wasn't that easy. It's not like easy as it is today to access, but it was something that was just sort of a normal part of my life. And then, of course, when I became an adult, then it kind of flowed from there.
Okay.
It never occurred to me that there was anything really wrong with pornography until about maybe 15 years ago or so. And I was sort of fresh off of a divorce, and I was doing what you're supposed to do after you get divorced, which is date a lot. And so I was out in the dating world, and I had, kind of an unholy mixture of money and youth and time. That gives you a lot of opportunities to be out there and in that planet. And I found myself really spending a lot of time trying to meet women, but not to have relationships with them. I mean, women were primarily for me mostly sexual objects. And I didn't really understand that there was a problem until one day my circle of male friends were all married at the time, and they were kind of living vicariously through my single guy lifestyle. And so we went out to dinner, and they wanted to hear, my latest exploits. And I had a particularly active week that week with multiple sexual partners. And I was just kind of talking about the experience, and they were high-fiving and having a great time with it. And as I was driving home, I felt very depressed. And I wasn't really sure why. And I was thinking to myself, it's very strange that, these guys think that I'm somehow doing something very positive, and yet I'm not feeling anything positive from it. If anything, every interaction that I would have would just make me feel more empty inside. And I felt like, okay, there's something's fundamentally wrong here. And that's when I started to kind of do a little bit of introspection. And in those days, the idea of sexual addiction wasn't really very well known or well talked about. And there's a lot of people in both academic circles and political circles that want to sort of kind of suppress that idea that there could be sexual addiction, because for them, it means that we're essentially stigmatizing sexual activity. But I started to think that maybe that I had a sexual addiction. Now, I had a lot of experience with working with people who had alcoholic addictions and narcotic addictions. And so using that sort of kind of mold, I started to kind of really work on myself and try to decide, what's wrong here? Why is it that these interactions that I'm having with women, which are almost exclusively sexual in nature, were not fulfilling? And in fact, actually that week, I had multiple sexual partners. On that drive home, one of the things that came to me was I couldn't remember a few of those women's names. And it really brought it home to me that something was really fundamentally wrong. One of the things when you deal with people with addiction is you look for the triggers, the things that cause them to engage in self-destructive behavior. And what had occurred to me was it was very obvious that it was my voracious consumption of pornography. And so it seemed like the pornography was leading me down a path where there was no interaction with a woman that would be satisfying enough. And I would always promise myself, well, it'll be the next one that would make me feel good inside. And I just kept feeling more empty and more empty. Now, I'd like to tell you that I stopped cold turkey with pornography right away. It was hard. I had to work really hard at it. It was very much like an addict's struggle, where you would give yourself a few days and then of course you'd relapse, and then maybe you could go a week and then you'd relapse. But what happened was eventually when I moved away from pornography completely, and then of course all of the things that flowed from that, going to strip clubs or going to a bar and looking for women who look like they're emotionally or psychologically vulnerable, those sorts of things, you would purposely stay away from those triggers. But they all started with pornography. And my friend group at the time was very, very confused because I was well known for having a large, sort of appetite for pornography. And they couldn't believe that I sort of stopped. But then what would happen was a few of them would come to me knowing that I had sort of made this journey. And then they started sharing their experiences with me. And it became very obvious to me that that pornography was much more insidious than I had been led to believe. And these were men who were in my age range who were struggling with infidelity. Some of them were going to see prostitutes, going on Craigslist, going to massage parlors. And then a few of them ended up being part of the criminal justice system. They actually took their addiction so far that they ended up being arrested and being criminally prosecuted. And it became very apparent to me that there isn't actually a healthy level of pornography, that it is something that when you introduce it, there is a cascading effect of self-injury that takes place. And that's not how it's portrayed in the media.
Right.
And I think that it becomes even worse now where the pornography is so on demand because of the nature of our electronics, that we've now developed a generation of young men who call themselves incels, involuntarily celibate, who have essentially sort of replaced normal, healthy sexual relations with pornography and masturbation. And what happens is, and I want to share the story mainly because I think there's a lot of especially men out there who would identify with this, that really you have to be careful when you rationalize why you're doing what you're doing. And what men will do is you'll basically kind of make excuses. Well, it's a healthy part of my sex life, or it's I'm an aficionado, which sounds a bizarre term, but a lot of men will say this, that they somehow look at it as a sort of artistic art form or something like that. But what really happens is, and what you have to do if you're listening to this, is ask yourself this question: is that pornography replacing something that should otherwise be there in a healthy relationship with a woman? And what I started to find was that when I left that world, suddenly my interactions with women became much more fulfilling, much more broad-based. I started to see women as companions, as someone that could be supportive of me and I could be supportive of them. I mean, it sounds awful to say this, but I actually cared what they thought. And then when I look back at that person that I was before, I didn't care. I didn't care what they thought. I just literally was waiting for that opportunity where I could manipulate them into wanting to have sexual relations with me. And the men that I've encountered that have had much more injurious lifestyle choices, I never place myself in a position of saying that I'm better than them. I could have been them, because the nature and trajectory in which that pornography addiction takes you eventually leads to those logical conclusions. Again, if you're listening to this and you find yourself, ask yourself this question, that when you first started watching pornography, was the type of pornography you're watching less aggressive before, less violent, less exploitative of women, and then now you've had to push yourself to something that's much more aggressive, much more demeaning. Do the people that you're seeing on that screen, do they look like they're being exploited or they're being demeaned? Your mind has gotten so much of the dopamine rush, that you need more and more, much like a drug addict would. And frankly, the science here is now incontrovertible. Everything from the National Institute of Health to the Journal of American Medical Association, studies in the United States, in Canada, in Western Europe have shown now that consumption of pornography has deleterious effects on brain chemistry. They have shown now young people who the elasticity of their brain tissue has been degraded in a way that you would normally see in people who are Alzheimer's patients. And so it is very, very dangerous in terms of what it does to you. And it is a very real addiction in the very real sense of the word. And so if you're finding that pornography is replacing some aspect of your normal relations, in terms of heterosexual relations with a woman, you have to stop and really kind of do this sort of introspection. And it's not easy. And you do need to seek out resources, because unfortunately you get bombarded with pornographic images, and they don't even have to be traditional pornography. Even regular television shows today have basically border on almost softcore porn.
Softcore,
And any of these things can form triggers. My wife and I were just at a restaurant the other day, and we parked, and there was a bikini barista kind of within eye shot, and I had to sort of duck my head down, because it sounds a bit odd, but those are triggers. Those are things that will cause those sorts of mental images to come into your mind. And when I was deep ensconced in that addiction, it creates a very rich fantasy life, but one that is very unhealthy. And doesn't lead to successful relationships, and certainly leads to self-destructive behavior.
Yeah. So thank you so much for that story. It's so layered, and I have so many questions.
Sure.
But to go back, so you said you started at age 10, and like you said, back in the 70s, there wasn't as much like on demand. It's not on your phone. It's not on YouTube. All of that stuff wasn't then. So did it start with like Playboy magazines and
absolutely.
So did you ever get caught? Did your parents ever walked in and said, Brian, what are you reading? Or how'd you get your hands on that?
You had to be real careful, right? You had to put everything back just the way you found it. You got very, very professional. Almost, we make the joke that when you're young and you start to accumulate your own little collection of it, you create like the bat cave. And, you're hiding it behind the mattress or behind the headboard, or, you find all kinds of weird cubby holes to put this stuff away in, just because you don't want your parents to catch you. But what's strange about it is that taboo aspect of it sort of added or lent itself to it being kind of almost like a fun game. And as a young man and my friends, we all enjoyed it. We all thought that there was nothing wrong with this. And then when we got to about college age, and we started taking, your classic liberal arts human sexuality class, where they actually, in my first week of a human sexuality class at the University of Washington, they played a pornographic movie they're in Kane Hall in front of everybody. And it was a pornographic movie. There's no other way to describe it.
Right.
And this was I'm not exactly sure what it was meant to accomplish, other than, hey, we signed up for the right class. We were all excited and happy, and this is cool. But the truth of the matter is it doesn't bring anything positive to the table. And what ends up happening is you do rationalize it. I rationalize it by saying that I was a kind of an artistic aficionado. I met people who were in the industry, and that somehow that made this somewhat of a kind of a legitimate exercise. But what you actually, interestingly enough, when you find out, when you meet people who are in the industry, is you meet people who are broken people. And they're the first ones that'll tell you that if they've been in the industry long enough, that they suffer tremendously from depression, suicidal ideation, many of the things that the rest of us suffer from porn addiction, they suffer from on the front end in the porn production.
Right.
And so it's really rough. There are two men in particular that I know in my life, and one of them I recently visited in prison, who were convicted of charges related to underage sexual activity. The truth of the matter is, I don't think that they started their planet off as pedophiles. Really, in talking to them, their pedophilia was a natural outgrowth of progressively more and more aggressive pornography. And soon it just became like nothing was enough. And they just needed to get that next more aggressive fix. One man in particular, the one that I just recently visited in prison, I was asking him about pornography. And what's interesting is in every single case, there isn't a single exception to the rule. Every single person tells me that they have a high consumption level of pornography. I have never met someone who has sexual dysfunction who has not told me that they don't consume voracious amounts of pornography. This particular guy, he liked the pornography that depicts young girls. And of course, the people that produce it do a very good job of making sure that they don't get caught selling child pornography. But there are women that, despite the fact that they're over 18, they look very young.
Yeah.
And it's marketed to these men who have a sexual attraction to girls and who are in their young teens. And he became addicted to that type of porn, to the point where he told me, I said, how did this happen? He said, one day I was just walking past my daughter's room, and his daughter was a young teenager, and he couldn't help himself, and he raped his daughter.
Wow.
And I don't think this man, if you were to ask me outside looking in, and I'd never met him before, I would tell you to burn him at the stake, because for me, something like that is about as evil as it gets.
Yeah,
and I'm not saying that he didn't do a horrendously evil act, but in talking to him, I understand the road that he went down. And he was a highly, highly successful, high functioning man. So this is not somebody that's sort of the kind of the classic dreg of humanity. This is somebody that was a very, very high functioning, well-respected person in his industry, wealthy, in fact. But that pornography addiction took him down a road where he literally altered his brain chemistry, much the same way a heroin addict would. And, a lot of times, you'll see drug addicts will rob people. And the truth is, I don't think these people are natural criminals. It's just that they've gotten to a point of desperation in their life where now robbing somebody to get the money for the drugs seems like the only logical outlet. And in this man's life, raping his daughter seemed like an acceptable life choice in that moment, even though I'm sure he understood the gravity and severity of his actions. But if you really track it back, it tracked to his pornography addiction. And so, not everybody's going to end up like that.
Yeah.
But what you do see is whereas for every one person like that, there's 100 people who
are on that track, right?
That track. They're unable to have monogamous relationships. They'll cheat on their spouse. They will not have good functioning sexual relationships with their partner. And it's because the pornography and obviously pornography and masturbation go together. It has replaced an important aspect of their life. And so, it's one of those things where now, having the breadth of time and being able to look back on it, I understand what was happening. And of course, I'm very thankful and grateful to my wife and, many aspects of my life, including my faith, that got me out of that cycle. But I also understand that anybody can be a victim of it. I can't ever become arrogant in my belief that maybe, I'm somehow past this. It's I don't know what permanent negative effects I've done to my brain chemistry as a result of decades of pornography addiction.
When did you see a progression in you said you were consuming porn at a large amount. What is that? I guess is that hours that you can grasp? And how many hours is that? And did it progress? It sounds like you kind of started with softcore porn, looking at imagery and stuff like that. Did it progress for you into hardcore porn?
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly, you know, the magazines and other prurient objects are interesting, but once you start to progress to the sort of the video imagery, it does take on a life of its own. One of the hallmarks of addiction is there something healthy that I would like to do right now, but I'm not going to do it. I'm going to put it off in favor of my addiction. And certainly that was the case with respect to pornography. Maybe I wanted to go grab a cup of coffee or watch a movie or hang out with a friend and have a beer or something like that. Oftentimes, if I have not had my pornography fix for the day, that would get pushed to the wayside, and that took precedence. And the problem with it was it then spurred me on to wanting to have relationships with women that were purely sexual in nature, but they were never enough. And so it wouldn't be unusual for me, literally 5 minutes after leaving a woman's house, to never call her again, forget her name, you know, delete her phone number from my phone. And because she ceased to function for me, she ceased to have any use for me because of that. And then I would immediately retreat to the pornography as if that somehow kind of bridged that gap. And it didn't. And it just made me feel progressively more empty inside. For other friends of mine that I've talked to, and they don't, you know, this is not something that men feel comfortable sharing with each other, because it almost feels like a defeat. One of the things that men pride themselves on is their sexual prowess amongst each other, amongst their peer group. That's something that we take great pride in. It's not something I'm proud to say, but it is something that's quite common. To admit that you have an inability to function with your wife, it's hard. It's very, very difficult. And a lot of men will tell me some variation of, I'm simply not attracted to her, or I'm simply unable to perform sexually with my wife in a normal way. But if I go to the massage parlor, that works, you know. And what that is a fundamental altering of their brain chemistry due to years and years and years of pornography addiction. And what's happened is their wife ceases to have that same ability to satisfy and have a normal sexual relationship with. And somehow now I need something new. I need something different, much the same way a drug addict might try moving from heroin to meth or something of that nature. And so it's, unless you have an ability to stop what's happening, you go down a very, very dark road. And unfortunately, now we've gotten to a stage where we're now decriminalizing prostitution in an effort to be, you know, more humane to the people who are in that sex trade industry. But what we're forgetting is now what we're going to do is we're going to fuel these addicts who are out there. You know, I have nothing against the sex workers, but the men who are trafficking in these women, they're exploiting them. And they don't even consciously, or not even consciously aware that they're exploiting them. You know, for me, I had the benefit that I had time and money. And so I could spend my time and money finding women who were willing to have sexual relations with me. But these other men don't. These other men they work all day. And so what they're going to do is they're going to go to Craigslist or a massage parlor or drive down Aurora Avenue and find a woman who is hurting and needs money real badly, and they're going to exploit her.
Yeah, they're going to use that.
And nobody in that interaction is coming out of it with anything positive.
Right.
And so that's unfortunately kind of the end result. But what we forget is what the initial trigger was. And that initial trigger was the pornography.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think that men who, quote unquote, don't find their wives attractive or can't perform with their wives, but then can perform with someone that they hardly even know, like at a massage parlor or someone they see, you know, off of Aurora, is there a factor of like, I respect my wife, so I can't do those acts with her, but I can do it with a random person?
I think that once you ensconce yourself in a hypersexualized fantasy life, your wife gets replaced. She performs a lot of other functions for you. You know, she takes care of you, she supports you, she talks to you when you come home, she does all the other things for you that that you need in a companion. But it's impossible for her to compete with a hypersexualized fantasy life. Much in the same way, you know, when you watch a movie that's hyper dramatized, you know, like let's say an over the top violent movie, Real violence doesn't look like that. Real violence can never look like that. This is Hollywood. It's a fantasy. And there is, in the same way that when you have intimate relations with someone that you love, it's much more holistic than simply the actual act of sex. There is a giving and a receiving and a mutual respect, and an understanding of this bond is greater than yourself. That's what makes that sexual life healthy. But when you remove those elements out of it and it's simply stripped down to its base essence, she can't compete with what you see visually in the pornography. It's just impossible. You're talking about people who first of all, they're very attractive people. The manner in which the things that they do are just not realistic. I've talked to many young women who find themselves unable to interact with young men because they think that real life sex, they want to emulate what they saw in pornography. And there's simply nothing that's loving about the way that is depicted. And so they're unable to find themselves finding a kind of a common bridge with men, because the men are just trying to copy what they see on screen. Yeah. And so your wife, as much as she may try, she can never compete with that hypersexualized fantasy life that you will gain from that pornography.
Hi there, Wellness Wednesday with 3W listeners. I just wanted to inform you that we're going to be splitting this episode into a 2-part episode since there's so much to talk about. Brian and I spoke for about an hour. And so please tune in next week for the second part of this really, really interesting, fascinating, and at times painful podcast. Thank you so much for hanging in there with us. We always appreciate every single one of you that gives us an opportunity to share with you stories and education and information that could potentially change your life. So tune in for next week. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. For more information about 3W, please visit our website at 3wmedical.org. That's the number 3, the letter W, medical.org. From there, you can learn more information about the services we provide, book an appointment, or make a donation if you'd like to support our mission. You can also call our office at 206-588-0311. That's 206-588-0311. If you like this episode, please share it with others and consider subscribing on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay healthy and be well.